A soldier and his daughter were mocked by his late wife's family when they inherited a run-down barn. But when the truth inside was revealed, the secret left everyone in regret. Inheritance, inheriting, an abandoned barn. Doesn't that sound like nothing but a joke for the whole world to laugh at? A sharp, cutting laugh sliced through the musty air, echoing off the stained brick walls. That barn, the only thing Jonathan had ever been left by his wife's family. The very last remnant of memory was now dragged out and made a spectacle paraded as proof of failure and disgrace placed squarely on the shoulders of someone who didn't share their blood. Jonathan Sterling, 45. A war veteran who had survived the Middle East stood frozen in the middle of the room. This man had crossed battlefields, walked the line between life and death, carried scars carved deep into his flesh, and wounds far deeper hidden in his soul. He knew loss. He knew the weight of burying fellow soldiers beneath burning sands. Yet here in the place called family, the humiliation cut sharper than anything he had ever faced on the battlefield. With his parents gone early, he had no anchor left among his in-laws. For years, this crumbling house had been his only refuge. To him, it wasn't an inheritance. It was the last shelter for his little girl, the final memory of Sarah, the wife who had once lit a lamp in the darkness of his life. Sarah, she had been that small, steady light guiding him home from the shadows of war when he returned with nothing but empty hands. But the wealthy conservative Whitmores had never accepted Jonathan. To them, he was trash, a useless burden Sarah had foolishly brought into their house. Their poisonous words, their scornful looks, their daily coldness had pushed her step by step toward despair. And one day, she collapsed, leaving Jonathan and his daughter floundering in a vast, uncaring void. Dad. The trembling voice tugged him back from the abyss of memory. Anna Sterling, 7 years old, stood shyly on the worn wooden steps. In her arms was a battered old doll, seams fraying and ready to split, but she clutched it as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Her pale blue eyes brimmed with tears like a tiny pond battered by a storm. She looked up at him, her gaze a mix of longing and fear. Jonathan opened his arms, and in a heartbeat, her small body flew into him, wrapping tight around his neck. He held her close, feeling her trembling echo in his own chest. Laughter cut the air again, sharp as barbs in the thick silence. 3 Whitmores sat in command around the dark wooden table like self-appointed judges. Their faces glowed with power and disdain, as if their very breath could erase Jonathan and his daughter from the room. Victor Whitmore, 68, still wiry and stiff-backed in a fitted suit like cold armor. His square gray eyes drilled into Jonathan without the faintest mercy. Jonathan, this ends here. This house belongs to the Whitmore family. It isn't for an outsider like you. You and that girl need to get out now. Our daughter died because she was foolish enough to follow a useless man like you. This home was hers, and now she's gone. You have no claim to stay. Leave before we throw you out. Beside him, Rebecca Whitmore. 65, sharp-eyed and brittle, sat ramrod straight, her voice dripping sour as vinegar. You couldn't even keep our daughter alive. You let her die clinging to a failure. And now you drag your broken self here expecting handouts. Forget it. That child, she's nothing but a burden, a weight dragging down the Whitmore name. We won't let a living disgrace pollute this house. Sarah's younger brother, David Whitmore, only 42. But his face carved deep with arrogance, folded his arms and sneered, "A crippled soldier and a useless little brat. You two belong on the street with your hands out." Jonathan's blood surged. He was used to contempt. He was used to venom flung at him. He had swallowed poverty, defeat, shrapnel, and fire. But when they spat on Sarah's name, the woman he had vowed to protect for life, and when he saw Anna cowering against him, lips pale with fear, something inside exploded. His fists clenched until blood welled beneath his nails. His jaw locked, veins bulged. In his head, the roar of gunfire, the screams, the chaos returned. He wanted to shout, to strike, to shatter their arrogance. But then looking down, he met his daughter's terrified eyes. She was trembling, shrinking from the shadow of his rage. He couldn't let her see him lose control. He forced the fire back inside, choking on it until he could barely breathe. Jonathan turned. Silently, he stuffed a few threadbare clothes into a worn shoulder bag. On a dusty shelf, the wedding photo leaned askew, Sarah in her white dress beaming while he stood in uniform, proud and strong. His hand shook as he lifted it. Just a second. Then he set it face down, as if burying the last spark of light in his life. "Dad? Where will we go?" Anna whispered, her voice as if afraid the wind would carry it away. Jonathan bent down, eyes bloodshot, voice solid as timber in a storm. "To a safe place, my girl. Somewhere no one will ever take you from me." Outside, the Atlanta sky opened, rain pouring in sheets, wine tearing at the eaves. Jonathan pulled on a faded overcoat, clutching his daughter tight as he stepped through the wailing door. The old car roared to life with a weary groan, its yellowed headlights cutting through the thick curtain of rain. He strapped Anna into the back seat, tightened the belt, then gripped the wheel. In the mirror, the red brick house blurred and vanished into the storm. With every turn of the tires, another piece of the past was buried. Anna glanced back, her eyes wide, and cold lips trembling with words she dared not speak. Jonathan bit down hard, his back rigid as steel. From this moment on, weakness was no longer an option. A home was stolen. A child cast out by her own blood. But this was not the end of their tragedy, only the beginning of darker shadows lying in wait. As their car merged onto the storm-drenched highway, two faint lights flickered behind them. Headlights, another car, slow, patient, following. Who was watching Jonathan and his daughter in the Atlanta rain that night, and what darkness waited up ahead? The old car groaned as it pulled away from Atlanta in the thick gray rain. The wipers scraped back and forth, revealing a slick black road glowing faintly gold, only to be swallowed up again in seconds. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel so hard the veins bulged on his hands. Each glance in the rearview mirror showed the city slipping farther away, just blurred streaks of light tearing loose from his life. Part of him wanted to stop, but his reason screamed turning back would mean collapse. In the passenger seat, Anna leaned her forehead against the cold window, clutching her faded doll. Her eyelids drooped, her breathing steady. Watching her, Jonathan pressed his lips tight, wishing at least for one night his little girl could sleep in peace without hearing venomous words, without seeing her mother buried in silence. He wondered, could the past really be left behind, or would it cling to them like a shadow? All night the steady hum of the engine drowned out his tangled thoughts. Road signs flashed by Tennessee, Kentucky, then Montana, Idaho. Jonathan hardly stopped surviving on watery gas station coffee before pressing on. The rain never let up the sky, a heavy lid of lead threatening to swallow them both. When a pale light seeped across the horizon, Jonathan rubbed his eyes, his neck stiff after hundreds of miles. A road sign appeared, Cedar Falls, 5 miles. He exhaled as though shedding a weight. Ahead lay a small town nestled in a valley ringed by dark green forests and mountains. No towers, no horns, only a scatter of wooden rooftops. The clatter of his engine echoed across the quiet valley. That very silence convinced him to stop. The car turned onto a red dirt road leading to the Wallace Ranch, abandoned for decades. To outsiders, it was nothing but a forgotten pasture and a decaying barn. But to Jonathan, it was the last inheritance from his grandfather, William Sterling. Back in the Depression era, William had bought the land as shelter. Later, when his comrade Wallace needed a roof, he patched it up. Locals came to call it the Wallace Ranch. Jonathan barely remembered his father bringing him here as a boy, the smell of rotting wood, the wind whistling through cracks. Then came war, then loss sweeping him away and leaving the place to weeds and ruin. His grandfather had left only a few handwritten notes never notarized. After his father's death, they were lost. Taxes went unpaid, and the county labeled it abandoned, no confirmed owner. Jonathan knew on paper it was empty, ripe for claim. But in his heart, this was his last route. He cut the engine and leaned back for a moment. "Daddy." "Are you tired?" Anna whispered. "I'm fine." Just need a short rest." He forced a smile. The little girl hugged her doll in silence. In that moment, Jonathan understood he had to be strong, not just for himself, but for those clear eyes watching him. He opened the door, breathing in the damp scent of grass. "Come on, sweetheart. This will be our new home." Before them stood the abandoned barn, peeling boards, a roof pocked with holes, a door sagging on rusted hinges. Vines twisted over it, weeds swallowing it whole. To others, it was ruin. But Jonathan saw one last chance to start again. From the trunk, he pulled Tool's hammer, shovel-worn gloves. His savings were nothing but the small discharge stipend he had held back for emergencies. Now, he would spend it to raise a roof for his child. Jonathan drove into town buying used boards, old tin sheets, cheap buckets of paint. For heavy work like beams and roofing, he hired local labor. Watching the money leave his wallet made his chest tighten, but he reminded himself, whatever it takes, as long as Anna has a home. By late afternoon, when the basic frame was up, he dismissed the workers. The rest he wanted to do with his daughter's hands beside his own. At the paint shelf, he chose warm yellow and fresh green. Anna's eyes widened. "Daddy, we're painting the whole thing." "Yes, it's not just a temporary shelter. This has to be our home." He smiled, streaks of paint already on his hands. Together they rolled paint. He covered the broad planks. Anna drew clumsy flowers on the doorframe. The slanting sun lit the new colors, and the barn seemed to awaken after a long sleep. 4 days later, the change was clear. The outer walls shone in yellow and green, the inside patched but sturdy. Jonathan set up an old table, stacked bricks into a small stove, built a low step at the door. "Daddy, you work so fast." Anna cheered. "One day I'll teach you. For now, just stay close to me." He wiped sweat, smiling faintly. By evening, the two dug soil for a garden. Jonathan drove the shovel deep, turning earth. Anna scampered to pull weeds. Suddenly, the shovel struck something hard. A sharp metallic clang rang out, not stone, not root. Jonathan froze, then dug again. A moss-covered plank emerged, flat and deliberate, as though carefully buried. "Daddy." "What's down there?" Anna's eyes widened. Jonathan knelt, gripping the shovel-tight, cold sweat beating his temple. In that instant, he knew this place was more than a new beginning. Some long-hidden sterling secret had been buried here, and now he and his daughter had stumbled upon it. What was lying in wait beneath the old earth of the abandoned barn? The sharp metallic clang rang out in the stillness of the late afternoon. Jonathan froze his hand, still gripping the shovel's handle. That sound was nothing like the scrape of stone or snag of roots he had struck 100 times before. It was hollow, sharp, as if the earth itself were calling after years of silence. He drew in a breath, heart pounding. A faint breeze swept across the field, carrying the damp scent of soil and the mossy tang of years gone by. Anna stood nearby, clutching her worn doll, her eyes wide, her voice trembling. "Daddy." "What's down there?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. He drove the shovel into the dirt, knelt, and dug a few more strokes. The soil loosened, revealing a flat, square plank covered in green moss. Thick layers clung to the surface, and when brushed aside, the wood beneath showed weathered silver gray. He wedged the shovel's tip under the edge of the board and pried gently. A brittle cracking sound broke the air, clumps of dirt sliding away, dust rising in a thin cloud. Anna sneezed softly, and Jonathan gave a fleeting smile, patting her back to reassure her. Yet his hand on her shoulder still trembled. Leaning lower, he scraped patiently, clearing away the last handfuls of soil. At last, a dark hollow yawned beneath the plank. Jonathan reached inside. His fingers met something cold and solid, thick with dust. With effort, he pulled it free. A rectangular wooden chest emerged, heavy, caked with dirt. The paint had long since peeled, exposing pale, faded grain. Rust mottled the hinges, the lock crusted in corrosion, barely clinging to its purpose. Jonathan drew out a handkerchief from his pocket and carefully brushed away the grime. He muttered under his breath, "No one's touched this in years." Anna leaned closer, doll pressed tight, her eyes shining with fear and wonder. Jonathan tried the lock, but it clanked and held fast. He glanced around, then pressed the hammer's head against it. With a sharp snap, the old metal shattered. For a heartbeat, father and daughter held their breath. The lid creaked open. A musty cloud burst forth pungent, forcing Jonathan to cover his mouth. Slowly, he raised the lid all the way. Inside lay folded layers of canvas, worn and fraying, wrapping various objects. One by one, Jonathan lifted them out. First came a set of carpenter's tools, their handles smoothed by long use, a handsaw, a plane, a chisel, a small hammer aged but clearly once cared for. Next, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked, and at the bottom, a silver box with a simple clasp. Jonathan set the box aside and held the journal. Brushing away the dust, he froze at the faded handwriting on the cover, William Sterling, 1935. His heart skipped. William Sterling, his grandfather, known only through a handful of stories his father had shared. And now, here was proof his handwriting pressed into leather nearly a century ago. Jonathan opened to the first page. The paper had yellowed brittle steeped in mildew. Lines of writing stretched across, recounting the days William had spent in this very barn during the Great Depression when work had vanished. He wrote of scavenging wood scraps from abandoned mills to craft tables and chairs, shoring up the rotting walls, scraping by with his calloused hands. One line struck Jonathan silent. Ruin is not an ending. It is the place from which we rebuild. And if one day my descendants return here, remember this, I have hidden the original will in a small compartment within the wooden chest. It is the final proof that this land belongs to the Sterling family. Jonathan trembled, hastily turning back to the chest. In the decayed fabric tucked into a concealed corner, he found a hidden slot. Inside lay an envelope sealed thick with wax. The faded script on its face was still clear, Last Will, William Sterling, 1935. He clutched it to his chest, heart pounding. For a moment the world went quiet. The wind in the field, the rustle of dry grass all vanished, leaving only his heartbeat and the flood of emotion rising in him. Carefully he slipped the envelope into the inner pocket of his coat and lowered the chest's lid. He sat still. Memories flooded back 15 years old, first learning to saw and plane under his father's hand. Later war had torn him away from the smell of wood, from the feel of grain beneath his palms, but his hands remembered. Anna sat close, whispering softly, "Daddy. Grandpa lived here too." Jonathan nodded, his voice thick. "Yes. And he wanted us to learn to stand again, just as he once did." He laid William's journal aside and reached for the silver box. The simple clasp gave way with a tap. Inside, wrapped in frayed silver thread, was a bundle of cloth. Jonathan unwrapped it. A small notebook slipped out, soft-covered, the handwriting so familiar it stunned him. Sarah's hand. His vision blurred, throat tightening. Why was Sarah's notebook here inside the family chest? His fingers shook as he turned the first pages. Ink smeared some words, fading, but each curve of her letters stabbed with recognition. A memory flared. He saw himself years younger, bringing Sarah to this land one stormy afternoon. They huddled under the leaking roof rain, pounding through holes in the tin. Sarah pressed close hair, soaked, her eyes lit with a strange calm. She had smiled, her voice small but steady above the storm. "If there's ever a place truly ours, I want to leave something here, so that someday if we lose our way, we'll have somewhere to return." Jonathan then had only held her, shielding her from the dripping water. But now through these pages he understood Sarah had returned here, leaving behind her thoughts in secret. The short entries brimmed with fear and love. She wrote of scorn from her family, of lonely nights when Jonathan worked late, of dark spells she could not share aloud. Yet there were tender lines too. "Jonathan is my only anchor, but he is as lost as I am. We need each other." The final page held an unfinished letter, hurried script trailing off. "Don't close yourself off. Seek out people, seek out kindness. Don't let the past imprison us." The sentence broke no period, no farewell. Jonathan clutched the notebook to his chest, his vision swimming. In his mind, Sarah's voice whispered as if beside his ear. Anna looked up, asking softly, "Daddy." Why did Mom write those things? Jonathan didn't answer right away. He closed the notebook, staring through the cracked barn door. Sunset spilled across the fields, casting everything in gold. The air smelled of soil and fresh paint, mingled with echoes of memory. He whispered almost to himself, "Do we still have a place in any community at all?" Anna pressed her cheek into his hand, her voice innocent. "What are you saying, Daddy?" Jonathan only shook his head, pulling her close. In his heart, a fragile idea flickered to life, hopeful, uncertain. Then his gaze shifted to a shadowed corner of the barn. In that darkness, another secret still waited untouched. The unfinished lines in Sarah's notebook echoed in Jonathan's mind all night. "Seek out people and seek kindness. Don't let the past imprison us." The sentence cut off without a period, as if she wanted him to be the one to finish it. The next morning the sun rose and spread a thin layer of light across the dew-soaked meadow. Birds chattered in the woods, their song mingling with the scent of fresh paint on the barn walls, carrying a feeling of peace and gentle urgency. Jonathan stood on the porch, watching his daughter sit on the step clutching her doll, her clear eyes gazing into the distance. He knew they couldn't lock themselves away in this wooden barn forever, no matter how carefully he had repaired and painted it. "Would you like to come with me into town?" he asked, his voice still tinged with hesitation. Anna looked up. The morning light shimmered in her eyes, spilling across her young face. She nodded eagerly, hugging the doll to her chest. "Yes. I want to see if there's a school here, and a church." Jonathan hesitated. He had grown too accustomed to scornful looks and whispered words in the past. But when he saw his daughter's expectant face, he sighed and nodded. "All right, let's find out." The old car rattled down the red dirt road. Cedar Falls appeared as they passed through the pines, a few rows of pale painted wooden houses, a small general store, a repair shop, and a red brick church whose bell tower pointed skyward like an arrow. The air was calm, but as soon as Jonathan stepped out, he felt the weight of the villagers' stares. On the store porch, George Peterson, a thin man with a faded cap, squinted hard at him. George had lived all his life in Cedar Falls, known for his stubborn conservatism and suspicion. Across the street stood Robert Jenkins, broad-shouldered with a thick beard. Arms crossed his gaze, cold. Another drifter looking for a place to squat. George muttered just loud enough for Jonathan to hear. Jonathan stiffened. He was used to contempt, but with Anna at his side, those words cut deep. He feared she might believe her father truly was nothing but a failure. He squeezed her small hand, then quietly led her inside. The smell of flour and old wood hung in the shop. On one wall, a wooden board held sheets of paper, scrawled notices: help wanted at the carpentry shop, Jenkins Farm hiring seasonal workers, church looking for janitorial help. Jonathan stood reading each one. Inside him, discouragement and a flicker of hope wrestled. He turned toward George, who leaned on the porch post, and asked quietly, "Is anyone else hiring around here?" George narrowed his eyes, answering curtly, "Robert Jenkins across the street needs a hand. But it's heavy work. I doubt you can handle it." Jonathan only nodded, saying nothing more. He took Anna's hand and crossed over. Robert was stacking hay onto a wagon. When he saw Jonathan approach, his brow furrowed. "What do you want?" Jonathan drew a deep breath and answered plainly, "I need work. Any kind. I've done carpentry, I know repairs. If you want, I can show you now." Robert studied him. Then he pointed to a large bundle of hay on the ground. "Tie that up tight. If you don't know how, don't waste my time." Jonathan said nothing. He rolled up his sleeves and bent down. His movements were swift, sure turning the bale, pulling the rope, knotting it firm. In moments, the bundle stood upright, neat and secure. Skills honed in the army and at the workshop returned to his hands. Robert frowned, then gave a short nod. "Not bad. Be here early tomorrow. I'll see what else you can do." Anna squealed softly, squeezing her father's hand. "I knew you could do it." Daddy. Jonathan looked at her, and for the first time that day, a smile touched his lips. Small as it was, it warmed the heart he thought had gone cold. The days that followed, Jonathan worked tirelessly. He helped George rebuild a sagging fence, driving each nail straight. He carried hay for Robert hefted heavy seed sacks onto his shoulder. Sweat poured down his hands, raw and blistered. Yet slowly, the doubtful stares softened. Trust, however fragile, began to take root in the town. By Sunday, Anna begged to go to church. Jonathan hesitated, wary of the strange looks, but at last he couldn't deny her. The red brick church glowed in the morning sun. When the organ began, the sanctuary filled with solemn stillness. The priest, a gentle man with snow-white hair, stood at the pulpit and asked, "Is there anyone who would like to offer a song today?" Anna sat clutching her father's hand. An older woman leaned down and whispered, "Would you like to sing something for your mother? Don't be afraid. We'll all listen." Anna bit her lip. Jonathan almost moved to stop her, but then her eyes shone. She stood and walked to the front. The room fell silent. Anna closed her eyes and whispered, "Mama taught me this song." And she began to sing. Her voice was thin but clear, carrying through the church. It was the simple hymn Sarah had sung to her on restless nights. Each note seemed to erase distance to bring Sarah's presence back among them. At first, the congregation sat hushed. Then, a few hesitant claps rang out, spreading until the whole church applauded. Jonathan gripped his daughter's hand, his throat tight. In that moment, he felt Sarah smiling, alive again in their child's song. When the service ended, an elderly woman from the front pew came to him, laying a hand on his shoulder, her eyes kind. "You and your daughter should keep coming. Cedar Falls has room for you both." Jonathan nodded, astonished. In his chest, a small, warm flame stirred after months of cold emptiness. That evening, the old car rattled back toward the Wallace Ranch. Anna hugged her doll, humming the hymn, then leaned her head on his shoulder, eyes drifting shut. Jonathan drove with a rare lightness in his heart, as though a new door had opened. But out in the fields, veiled in mist, a shadow stood motionless. A man in a heavy coat watched the freshly painted barn, its yellow and green walls glowing against the grass. He raised a phone, snapped a few pictures, then lifted it to his ear. His gravelly voice carried in the wind, "I've found it. This development project will be huge." Then he turned, his figure swallowed by the evening fog. Behind him, the little house stood silent, unaware that a new storm was already gathering. Weeks passed, and Cedar Falls settled into a new rhythm. Jonathan grew accustomed to fixing up the barn, propping old chairs and tables in place, clearing weeds along the path. Each brushstroke of paint, each strike of the hammer seemed to erase a little more of the ruin. Anna, her rare smile returning, began to blend in with the children at church. Her clear voice, rising in prayer, gave Jonathan the uncanny feeling that Sarah was still watching, gently guarding them. The townsfolk, once wary, now started to open their hearts. One afternoon, George Peterson dropped by and slipped Anna a basket of ripe red apples. "A gift for our little artist," he said. Anna chirped her thanks, her bright eyes sparkling. Jonathan watched, a strange warmth filling him. For the first time, he felt a true glimmer of hope. Perhaps the door Sarah had spoken of in her unfinished letter, "Seek out the kindness out there," was finally opening. But back in Atlanta, the Whitmores were not about to let go so easily. In a lavish banquet hall, glowing with golden light, David Whitmore sat across from Marcus O'Connor, a slick real estate broker with a cigar between his fingers. Zoning files were spread across the table. Marcus laid down several photographs, the barn freshly painted yellow and green, Jonathan carrying boards, Anna clutching her doll. "The government just approved the highway expansion," Marcus said in a low voice. "Land around Cedar Falls is about to skyrocket in value, and the Sterling property is right at the center." David stiffened, his eyes blazing. He hissed through his teeth. "Sarah disgraced our entire family when she chose him. She died early, and that should have been the end of it. But now that worthless patch of land has turned into pure gold. There's no way a poor soldier and his brat are going to profit from it. People would laugh us out of town. I swear I'll take it back, whatever it costs." Victor gave a silent nod. Rebecca's grip tightened on her glass, her knuckles whitening. To them, Sarah had long been nothing more than a traitor, and now, even in death, Her name served only as fuel for their ambition. A week later in Cedar Falls, the postman delivered a thick envelope stamped from Atlanta. Jonathan signed for it, a chill creeping through him. Under the dim yellow light, he opened it. Current records show the property occupied by Mr. Jonathan Sterling has no certified title. You are hereby ordered to vacate within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in legal action without further notice. The cold words clamped around his chest. This was surely the Whitmore's doing. The land was his grandfather William Sterling's inheritance, but the documents were only old handwritten notes never notarized. After his father's death, the originals had been lost. The land left abandoned taxes unpaid. On county records it read, "Abandoned, no verified legal owner." That loophole was enough to brand him a squatter. Jonathan's grip tightened around the letter as though a noose were cinching tighter. He had endured scorn for years, but this time the blade pointed straight at Anna. If he lost this land, his daughter would believe her father powerless, unable to guard the family's roots. That was the one humiliation no man could wash away. That night, he could not sleep. He sat at the wooden table, the letter spread wide, the flickering lamplight casting his hunched shadow like that of a beaten man. In his mind rose Sarah's desperate eyes, David's mocking laughter, Rebecca's icy voice, Victor's cold nod, and then Anna's face as she sang in church, her eyes shining like hope itself. He asked himself how much longer could he protect her. Outside, the wind howled across the meadow as if heralding a storm about to break. Near midnight, Anna stirred and saw her father sitting motionless. She padded over, clutching the doll her mother had once sewn. "Daddy, why aren't you sleeping?" Jonathan started, then forced a smile. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. Tomorrow's a church day." But Anna laid her small hand over his and asked softly, "Mama wanted you to do this too, didn't she?" Her innocent words pierced through the fear in his chest. Tears welled up, falling onto the lawyer's letter. He reached under the bed for the old chest and pulled out William's leather journal. On its yellowed page, the line stood out, "Ruin is not an ending. It is the place from which we rebuild." Jonathan closed the book, meeting his daughter's eyes, his voice steadier. "You're right. We don't give up." Anna nodded, resting against his shoulder, whispering, "I believe in you, Daddy." Jonathan wrapped her in his arms. Outside, the wind tore through the fields of Cedar Falls, but inside that small house, a new resolve was kindled, not just against the ghosts of the past, but against the forces closing in. He lifted his head. In the distance, the town's lights twinkled. A dog's bark echoed faintly. For the first time, Jonathan believed that when the storm came, he and Anna would not be alone. The night he received the letter from the Atlanta law firm, Jonathan barely slept. Every word of that notice hung over him like a cold noose, suspended above his and his daughter's heads. He knew the Whitmores had finally struck. Yet when Anna's gentle eyes asked, "Mama wanted you to do this too," didn't she? An unshakable resolve had flared to life within him. Early the next morning, he went to see Mr. Harris, the elder statesman of Cedar Falls, a man everyone respected. He was well past 60, his cropped silver hair neat, his back straight as a pine, his eyes deep and steady as if they could pierce through a man's soul. The townsfolk often said, "Harris is a man money can't blind." In the small room with its old wooden table, Jonathan laid the yellowed papers of his grandfather William before him. Harris turned each page slowly, his face grave. "Sterling," he said carefully, "these papers aren't notarized to today's standards. If you take them to Atlanta, the Whitmore's lawyers will dismiss them outright." Jonathan clenched his fist. After a pause, he added another piece, the letter his grandfather had written, pointing to the line. "I hid the original will in the small compartment of the wooden chest." Harris looked up, his eyes suddenly sharp. "You found it?" "Yes," Jonathan answered firmly. "The will has witness signatures and the local seal of that time. All I need is one chance to prove it." The room fell silent. Harris weighed the power of the Whitmore name against the steadfastness in Jonathan's eyes. At last, he gave a slow nod. I can't promise the outcome, but this community deserves to hear both sides. Tomorrow, bring your evidence to the town hall. Let the truth speak for itself." The next day, the small town hall was packed. Wooden chairs lined in rows, whispers thick in the heavy air. Usually this place handled crop schedules or boundary disputes, but today it brimmed with tension. Jonathan sat in the front row, Anna clutching his hand, her doll pressed to her chest. The girl's eyes scanned the crowd and found George Peterson, Robert Jenkins, even the parish priest. They nodded to him, small nods, but heavy with silent support. The door opened. The Whitmores entered. Victor led, slow and deliberate but exuding authority. Rebecca followed in her prim gray dress, lips, tight eyes cold. And last came David, hugging a thick file of documents, striding to the front with arrogant defiance. The gavel struck. Harris declared, "Today we will hear both sides present their claims over the land where the Sterling family resides." David rose at once, his voice ringing. "Our family has full legal documentation proving that property belongs to the Whitmores. Here, records stamped in Atlanta." He raised the bright red folder high. The crowd murmured. Jonathan sat still, his hand tightening around Anna's shoulder as if to shield her. Victor stepped forward, his voice heavy with threat. "Don't forget, for years, the Whitmores funded your market fairs, your main road. If Cedar Falls sides with Sterling, don't expect another dime from us." Rebecca clutched her leather purse, her words as cold as ice. "He couldn't even keep our daughter alive, and now he drags his child here for pity. That girl Anna will carry shame wherever she goes. Better she leave this town sooner rather than later." Anna trembled, clutching her doll, pressing into her father's side. Jonathan ground his jaw, struggling to stay composed. David leaned close, his voice low for Jonathan's ears, alone. "Careful, Sterling. If you fight us, I'll make sure your daughter never sets foot in a Cedar Falls school." The whispers surged across the room. Jonathan's chest burned hot. He rose, opened his worn leather satchel, and placed each item on the table. His voice was deep, slow, but steady. "These are the true proofs. My wife Sarah's journal, she wrote that this land was the only root our family had left. My grandfather William Sterling's journal, he wrote of building this barn to survive the Depression. And last, the original will bearing witness signatures and the legal seal of its time." He lifted the yellowed page, the ink trembling, but still clear, and read aloud. "I hid the original will in the small compartment of the wooden chest. This is the proof that the land belongs to the Sterling family." Harris gestured to the town's elderly attorney. Adjusting his glasses, the man's voice rang. "By today's standards, this document could be contested, but judged by the law of its time, it is fully valid. 2 witnesses, the local seal. Combined with journals, letters, living testimony. This is both legal and moral evidence. Very difficult to overturn." The crowd erupted, heads nodding. Their eyes on Jonathan had changed, no longer doubtful, but respectful. David's face blanched. He slammed his file on the table, snarling, "My papers are the only ones that matter. Atlanta won't even glance at this pile of junk. There, money and power decide everything. Sterling, you will never win." Victor lowered his head in silence. Rebecca turned her gaze away from Anna, but David's face burned red as his voice thundered through the hall. Jonathan drew Anna closer, clutching the will in his other hand. His heart pounded, but his eyes burned bright. He knew the truth was no longer his alone. All of Cedar Falls had seen it. From outside, the church bell tolled long and solemn. David stormed out, his coat flaring, casting one last venomous look behind. Jonathan bent low, hearing Anna whisper, "Daddy. Mama must be so proud. I believe in you." Jonathan gave a small nod. In that low-ceilinged room, a new faith had been kindled, yet deep down he knew the Whitmores had not surrendered. Atlanta, where David had sworn to drag him into court, still lay ahead. The legal battle had only just begun. News of the land dispute in Cedar Falls quickly reached Atlanta. The revelation that a powerful family like the Whitmores might have forged documents set public opinion ablaze. Local newspapers ran headlines, "Atlanta court to hear inheritance dispute involving the Whitmore family. Allegations of forgery surface." The Whitmore name, long tied to influence and prestige, was now dragged before justice, and crowds gathered to witness. On the day of the hearing, the Atlanta courthouse was packed. Jonathan climbed the cold stone steps, Anna gripping his hand tightly, her wide eyes overwhelmed by the imposing building. Inside, the Whitmores were already seated. David sat with arms crossed, eyes burning with defiance. Victor remained silent and stern. Rebecca deliberately avoided looking at her granddaughter. The trial stretched over several days. Jonathan's lawyer began by presenting the evidence: Sarah's journal, William's handwritten letters, and most importantly, the original will found, hidden in the small compartment of the wooden chest buried beneath the old barn, bearing the signatures of 2 witnesses and the official seal of that time. The Whitmore attorney lashed back sharply. Personal journals carry no legal weight. The so-called original could have been fabricated. How can authenticity be proven after nearly half a century? The courtroom buzzed. Jonathan stood, his voice calm. The witnesses are still here. George Peterson and Robert Jenkins stepped forward. George spoke slowly. I remember William Sterling proudly telling me and several neighbors. He said clearly, "This will be the home for my descendants." Robert nodded, adding, I myself heard him say he left papers for the generations to come. I'm not surprised Sterling found them. Then the parish priest came forward, his voice solemn. During many confessions, William spoke of this will. His greatest hope was that his family would not lose their roots. The testimonies weighed heavy in the room. The Whitmore attorney paled with nothing left to counter. Atlanta's press reported court leans toward Sterling. William Sterling's will, deemed valid. Whitmore, suspected of forgery. The words were not sensational, but they struck like a bell toll signaling the downfall of an old dynasty. On the day of judgment, the judge struck the gavel, his voice firm. After review, the court concludes that documents provided by the Whitmore family show signs of forgery. The original will of William Sterling, supported by letters and witness testimony, is recognized as valid. The Whitmore family is ordered to compensate Mr. Jonathan Sterling for damages and to withdraw from all disputes concerning the Cedar Falls property. An uproar filled the chamber. Jonathan exhaled, his shoulders lightened as if a boulder had been lifted. Anna squeezed his hand, whispering, Daddy, you won. Mama must be smiling. Jonathan nodded, eyes wet. Not just me. You and grandfather, too. You gave me the strength to stand. Victor bowed his head. Rebecca dared not meet Anna's eyes. David stormed out, heels echoing angrily against the stone floor. News traveled back to Cedar Falls. Townsfolk gathered in the square, reading the papers, whispering. Some even sent letters of encouragement to Jonathan. You have preserved the honor of an entire generation of Sterlings. A few days later, the town held a small celebration in the square. Wooden tables lined up baskets of red apples, pies on display, the sound of a violin filling the clear afternoon air. Anna darted among the children, her laughter ringing bright. Jonathan sat on the wooden porch, shaking hands with each well-wisher. George Peterson laid a hand on his shoulder, his voice raspy but warm. You're no outsider anymore. Cedar Falls counts you and your daughter as family. Robert Jenkins added, his eyes glistening. Perhaps you didn't know. Years ago, it was William Sterling who helped me rebuild my granary after the storm. I've owed him ever since. Now it's time I pay it back. Jonathan froze, his throat tightening. He looked around. Faces that had once doubted him now stood beside him, ready to share his burden. As the party ended and the sun sank behind the mountains, Jonathan led Anna back to the Wallace Ranch. The barn still wore its patchwork of yellow and green paint, its roof leaking, its floor uneven. Yet to Jonathan, it no longer felt like a weight, but a beginning. Just then, Robert and George arrived with several townsfolk. They laid down planks of wood shovels and hammers. Robert clapped Jonathan on the shoulder, smiling gently. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Starting tomorrow, we'll rebuild together, not just with our strength, but with kinship. Anna came running, clutching her doll, her face beaming. Daddy, we're really going to have a true home now, aren't we? Jonathan bent low, gathering her in his arms. Tears fell, but this time they were tears of gratitude. Behind him, Neighbors were already lifting boards onto the barn's old frame, turning a place once abandoned into a new home. The sunset poured across the fields, shining on a house built not only with wood and nails, but with the faith of a community. Winter had passed. The snow-melted streams along the edge of town gurgled again, and starlings gathered on the roof of the red brick church. Cedar Falls welcomed the first clear rays of spring shining down on the once-abandoned barn, now painted in warm yellow and soft green. The coat of paint Jonathan and Anna had brushed on during the gray days of winter was thin and uneven, but under this new light it seemed to glow as if smiling. That morning, Jonathan pushed open the creaking wooden door and froze. Out on the damp grass, Robert Jenkins, George Peterson, and many townsfolk had gathered. Some carried saws, others hefted hammers, and a few boys held fresh planks. Women arrived with baskets of food, one even bringing a steaming pot of soup. The whole scene was alive with energy like a barn-raising festival. "It's time to rebuild this place properly," Robert said, his heavy hand resting on Jonathan's shoulder. Jonathan hesitated. For years he had been used to struggling alone. Now, seeing the whole community surrounding him, his chest warmed, but his throat tightened. Anna darted out her eyes, shining. "Daddy, so many people are helping. Our house is going to be beautiful." The work began. George set up a frame and handed Jonathan an old plane. The weight felt strange in his hands. It had once been second nature when he was a boy. He set the plank, drew in a breath, and pushed the blade forward. But his motion was stiff. The cut went crooked. The board split in two. Laughter rose. Anna clutched her doll and giggled, covering her mouth. "Daddy, you broke it." Jonathan flushed red, but Robert clapped his shoulder and murmured, "Don't force it. Let the blade follow your breath, Sterling. Carpentry is patience, not strength." Jonathan tried again. This time the plane glided, smoother, thin curls of wood rolling down. Slowly, the calloused hands remembered their old rhythm. Sweat ran down his face, but the corner of his mouth lifted in a faint smile. All day, hammers rang and saws rasped, mingling with laughter and chatter. George drove nails with the speed of a younger man. Robert hauled heavy beams as if they were nothing. Elderly onlookers stood nearby, recalling how William Sterling had once helped rebuild a granary after a storm. One elder said softly, "We owe William. Now that his kin need us, how could we stand aside hearing it?" Jonathan's chest swelled with emotion he couldn't put into words. Meanwhile, Anna spread a cloth under the tree, took out her worn box of crayons, and began to draw. By late afternoon, she held up a large picture, a bright house surrounded by familiar faces, George Robert the priest and her father smiling. In one corner, she drew her mother in a pale blue dress standing under the eaves with her hand on father and daughter's shoulders. Carefully, Anna pinned the drawing to the barn wall and whispered, "So Mama will always be here in the house with us." Jonathan froze, his eyes blurring. He bent down, wrapped his arms around her, his voice hoarse. "You've turned this place into a true home." When the work paused, Robert opened an old wooden chest he had brought. From it he carefully placed into Jonathan's hands a worn set of carpenter's tools, a plane, a hammer, a saw handle. His voice was steady, warm. "These once belonged to your grandfather. William gave them to me to keep after he helped me rebuild my granary years ago. I've held on to them for decades, waiting for the day I could return them to someone worthy." Jonathan's hands trembled as he received them. The handles were smooth with age, the steel dulled, but as he touched them, it felt as if he were holding his grandfather's very hand. Anna looked up, her eyes sparkling. "Daddy, that means we'll never be alone again." "Right," Jonathan nodded, his voice breaking. "That's right, sweetheart. From now on, we will have a bigger family." Sunset fell. The barn doors stood open, catching the last golden light of day. Jonathan stood with Anna, and behind them were George Robert and the many faces of Cedar Falls. In that glow, they were no longer a lonely veteran and a motherless child. They were part of a community, rebuilding a home not only with wood and stone, but with kinship itself. That evening, the new home stood bathed in sunset, framed by the hands of the Cedar Falls community. The image lingered in Jonathan's heart as the truest beginning. And when winter retreated and spring arrived, that beginning sprouted into new life. Snow melted along the hillsides, revealing a carpet of green grass. Starlings swooped down onto the red brick church roof, filling the air with cheerful song. The land around the house, once an abandoned barn swallowed by weeds, was now filled with voices and laughter. The roof had been repaired, the windows shone, and the walls of warm yellow mixed with fresh green reflected the morning light as though Sarah and Anna themselves had breathed life into them. Jonathan sat inside the renewed house at a freshly built wooden table. In his hands was William's old plane, its wooden handle worn smooth. He set a board on the frame, drew in a deep breath, and pressed the blade forward. A harsh rasp echoed, the cut went crooked, and the board split in two. He frowned. Nearby, Robert Jenkins lit a cigarette, blew smoke aside, and chuckled. "Don't force it, Sterling. Let the blade move with your breath. William's blood runs through your hands. Don't forget that." Jonathan pressed his lips tight and tried again, still uneven. That night he sat alone under the yellow lamplight, reopening William's journal. The trembling words came alive. "Wood yields only to patient hands. Ruin is not an ending. It is the place to rebuild from the start." Jonathan closed his eyes, picturing his grandfather's hand guiding his own. The next morning, when he tried again, the wood curled away, smoothly, ribbons falling in even strips. Jonathan exhaled. His boyhood memories stirred that he had once learned the craft from his father, but war and loss had buried it. Now, with William's words echoing his hands, found their rhythm again. Jonathan began making small works, a pencil box for the children, a wooden frame for the church, a bench beneath the tree where folks gathered. Each gift lit up the faces of those who received them. Soon the people of Cedar Falls began calling him by a new name, the town carpenter. One afternoon, Anna ran in, set her doll on the table, and looked at him with unusual seriousness. "I want to learn carpentry like you, Daddy." Jonathan froze, his eyes moist. "Are you sure this trade is hard? It takes patience at every step." Anna nodded, her voice bright as spring sunlight Mama taught me to sing. "Now I want to learn your hands. I'll carry both legacies." Jonathan said nothing, only pulled up a chair for her. He handed her a small hammer, guiding each movement. Her tiny hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. In those eyes, he saw Sarah alive through her song, and now through the first lines carved in wood. From that day, Jonathan began holding small lessons. Children from the village flocked in, filling the yard with laughter. One clutched a hammer, awkwardly missing the nail, and sending the others into peals of laughter. A mother stood nearby, smiling behind her hand, while the priest tried his own cut on a board, sweat shining on his brow. Jonathan corrected each move patiently. "Don't force it. Let the wood listen to your hands." Anna stood close, watching intently. She picked up scraps of wood, shaped them into petals, and handed them to each child as gifts. Laughter spread across the yard, mingling with the scent of fresh-cut timber and the aroma of soup simmering on the grass. Cedar Falls, once closed off, now drew together around the house in the sound of carpentry. Late in the afternoon, Jonathan and Anna dug a small hole beside the house. In their hands was a young sapling, leaves bright green. They set it down, packed the soil, and watered it. Anna took a slim wooden stick and carefully carved Jonathan and Anna. She placed it at the tree's base and whispered, "This tree will grow along with our home." Jonathan wrapped his arms around her, lifting his eyes. In that sapling, he saw the spirit of William, the one who passed down the legacy. Sarah, the one who left behind her song, and Anna, the new life springing forth. He whispered, his voice low but firm. "Yes, sweetheart. This is the beginning of a new life." The young tree stood firm in the moist earth, its leaves trembling in the spring breeze. The sunset stretched wide, casting the shadows of 3 generations of Sterlings, past, present, and future, bound together by a single inheritance family. A year passed quietly. Cedar Falls shifted with the 4-season summer, glowing with evenings when the whole community gathered under the moon, guitar music echoing across the meadow, autumn dropping golden leaves as children scampered collecting chestnuts in front of the barn, winter blanketing the land in white snow, yet the young tree Jonathan and Anna had planted still stood proud, its bare branches unbroken. And now, spring had returned. The tree had grown taller, its green leaves trembling in the breeze, the carved words, Jonathan and Anna, still etched clearly into its trunk. The barn that once stood, abandoned, rotting, and gray, now wore a new face. Warm yellow blended with fresh green glowed beneath the spring sun. Its roof was freshly tiled, windows opened wide, the wooden floor creaked solid beneath their steps. Inside, the furniture, Jonathan had built by hand, stood neatly arranged. On the wall hung Anna's painting, a home filled with laughter, with the quiet figure of her mother, drawn in the corner, displayed as a gentle reminder. Townsfolk passing by often stopped to admire it, regarding the place as a symbol of trust and hope. That afternoon, all of Cedar Falls gathered around the house. A small but joyful celebration, the smell of pies, drifting warm baskets brimming with red apples, the violin's notes dancing in the fresh air. Children ran laughing in circles, adults shared handshakes and knowing glances. The priest led a prayer, speaking of unity and of the journey through loss. George Peterson and Robert Jenkins stood beside Jonathan, their sun-worn faces shining with quiet pride. Jonathan sat near the bonfire. The flames lit his rugged face, now less shadowed than in years past. His gaze followed Anna, laughing brightly among her friends, then swept to the community around him, once strangers, now his larger family. He gently opened William's old leather journal. Its final page remained blank, as if waiting for closure. A small hand rested on his. Anna sat down beside him and whispered, "Mama would be so happy, wouldn't she?" Daddy Jonathan smiled, his eyes misting. "Yes, sweetheart. She would be." He lifted his pen and wrote slowly, "This house has passed through sorrow. Now it carries hope." He paused, then added another line. "If someday someone finds this journal, remember the Sterling family rose from ruins, and anyone can do the same." Music, voices, and clapping rose together as firelight flickered against the new wooden walls. The barn, once abandoned, now blazed like a lighthouse, guiding, reminding, and strengthening all who had fallen. When the gathering ended, Jonathan and Anna stepped with the others to the young tree beside the house. Its trunk had thickened its small crown, casting shade on the grass. Jonathan placed his rough hand on its bark. Anna set her tiny hand atop his. Around them stood George Robert the priest, and many familiar faces, all silent in reverence. Anna looked up, her eyes bright. "Daddy, where will our journey lead next?" Jonathan squeezed her shoulder, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Forward, my girl. Always forward." The sunset spread wide. The house. The tree. Jonathan and Anna and the community of Cedar Falls stood together, past, present, and future, joined in one whole moment. The journey of Jonathan and Anna ended not with a glorious victory over enemies, but with something simpler they had learned to trust again. Jonathan, once a solitary soldier burdened with shame, had become a steadfast anchor for his daughter through love and patience. Anna, once a trembling child in the shadows, now found the courage to draw her family anew, simple sketches, yet enough to warm an entire home. This story reminds us that justice does not always arrive immediately, but truth always finds its way into the light. Above all, family is the lamp that guides us through the night. Loss may take much away, but with compassion and persistence, we can rebuild from ruins. In the end, what matters is not how many times we fall, but whether we have the courage to rise again for the ones we love. And have you ever had a time when only family or love kept you moving forward? Share your story, for it may become the strength someone out there needs. And remember, take good care of yourself, because you too deserve healing and love.